This is the first episode on becoming a world champion in asset recovery, Nigeria's experience.
Now, before handing over to Juliet and Emmanuel, I would like to set the scene a little bit, in particular for those amongst you that are a little bit less familiar with Nigeria. Nigeria, with more than 230 million inhabitants, is by far the most populous country in Africa. Nigeria prides itself of its diversity, with more than 250 different ethnic groups speaking more than 300 distinct languages. The Federal Republic of Nigeria is composed of 36 states and a federal capital territory, and it has been conducting democratic elections consistently since 1999. Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa, though the GDP per capita remains around $1,000. And according to the National Bureau of Statistics of Nigeria, approximately 60% of Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty. Historically, Nigeria gained its independence from Britain in 1960, and after a relatively short-lived period of democratic rule, that was abruptly ended in 1966 by a military coup and followed by ethnic tensions and a civil war that lasted from 1967 to 1970. The country remained under military rule until 1999, with a short interruption in the early 80s. Oil was first discovered in Nigeria in 1956, but it is only in the 70s and 80s that the oil sector really starts to dominate the economy, providing government immense income, but also creating incentives for large-scale corruption. In 1998, the then military head of state, Sani Abacha, dies, and that evened the way to democratic elections. Abacha's death also marked the start of a sustained investigation into the massive looting of public funds by him, his family, and associates, involving a large variety of corrupt schemes ranging from outright embezzlement of funds from the central bank to complex bribery schemes, fraudulent contracts, and sophisticated money laundering arrangements. It is estimated that during Abacha's rule, him and his associates stole some $3 to $5 billion. But Nigeria did not stop at the Abacha case. Rather, the government made the recovery of stolen assets a consistent foreign policy priority spanning multiple political administrations. Today, there are more than 40 cases recorded in the asset recovery database of the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative of the World Bank and UNODC for a total value of 2.7 billion. So truly, Nigeria, in my book, is the world champion in asset recovery. So now that we have set the scene, I would like first to turn to Emmanuel, and I hope he has joined us now. Bachon?
Yes.
Are we ready? Emmanuel, I would like to ask you, can you give us an overview of Nigeria's asset recovery effort, in particular during those early years following the return to democracy?
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that Nigeria's success story began shortly after the death of General Abacha in 1998. The head of state who took over, General Abdul Salam, responded to public outcry and constituted a special investigation panel which investigated the corruption associated with the Abachas. These initial efforts domestically led to some recoveries of well over 800 million, which was surrendered voluntarily by the Abachas and was documented in a decree called Decree 53 of 1998. This domestic early success also ignited the interest, and Nigeria launched several investigations in various jurisdictions, particularly in Switzerland, UK, Belgium, JC, and several other countries. And Nigeria enlisted the services of Mr. Enrico Monfrini, a Swiss-based legal practitioner, to help with these efforts. And this was followed by several letters, rogatory, and mutual legal assistance requests, both in Switzerland and several other jurisdictions. In Switzerland, in particular, Nigeria also lodged a criminal complaint against the Abachas and applied to join as a party to enable her participate fully in these proceedings. These early letters of requests to various jurisdictions also led to the initial success of freezing some assets, particularly 360 million in countries like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. UK, I must note, initially did not conduct criminal investigations, but Nigeria adopted the approach of launching a civil action against the Abachas in the UK. And this was assisted by the use of domestic lawyers in the UK, Edward Angel, Palmer, and Dodge, which was driven by Tim Daniel. This multifaceted approach by Nigeria, in other words, using both the criminal and civil process to recover assets, enabled Nigeria to put sufficient pressure on the Abachas, and at some stage they attempted a settlement, even though they reneged on it later. But these multifaceted approaches began to bear fruit in 2005, 2006, when Switzerland, for the first time, returned well over $505 million to Nigeria from the recoveries from the Abacha criminal organization. There were also recoveries associated with that organization. From Jersey, 22 million pounds was recovered. Indeed, as at 2013, well over $1.2 billion had been recovered from the Abachas from across the globe. It is important to note that asset recovery is impossible to recover every kobo or every dollar that has been stolen, but a substantial recovery is good enough. Because this is a long process, it's often very complicated. You can see that even though Nigeria started in 1998, even as we speak, there are still some unconcluded process to recover all that the Abachas stole. But in summary, we can say that these are some of the successes, some of the factors that led to the success of the the recovery of assets from the Abachas. There was sustained political will. The Nigeria used a combination of experts, both legal and forensics, to do the recovery, and there was an effective law enforcement to law enforcement collaboration. International cooperation by partners was also very, very evident, particularly the Swiss government and the UK government. It should be noted that the Abacha recoveries was not just the only recovery that Nigeria embarked upon. Several other politically exposed persons were also investigated during and within the period that the Abacha assets were recovered. Cases like Ibori, cases like DSP Alamesia, cases like Daria were also, they are highly politically exposed persons in Nigeria. They were former governors, and a large chunk of assets were also recovered from this set of individuals. So given all these efforts, we can say that we have recorded a substantial success in recovering assets. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for this kind of initial overview. And I think it's maybe worthwhile mentioning that we're now joined by about more than 70 people from around 30 plus countries around the globe. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Now, let me turn over to Juliet. We're now in the early 2010s, and we are starting to entering sort of like the first phase of real maturation of the asset recovery agenda in Nigeria. Now, you became particularly closely involved following your appointment as special advisor to the president for justice sector reform and international relations, and when you started leading the Nigerian delegation in negotiating some of these major asset returns that I already mentioned earlier. Now, tell us a little bit more about these agreements, how they came about, and what was your experience in negotiating them on behalf of Nigeria?
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, and great to be here. Good morning, everyone. Well, Nigeria's negotiation occurred across multiple countries, particularly United States of America, United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, as well as Bailiwick of Jersey. I think significantly, the first one which we negotiated was, pre from 2015 down. The 2017 agreement between Nigeria, Switzerland, and which was now countersigned by the World Bank as a monitor. This agreement led to the return of 311 million plus to Nigeria. And this also is part of the Abacha-related assets that were held up between Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. Eventually, Switzerland had to take custody of all the funds. The process of negotiation, I think, is what is critical, which is that Nigeria had to engage actively with these countries to make sure that, first of all, there was a unanimity of agreement that funds should be returned. And secondly, that in returning these agreements, what were the main criteria? Switzerland was quite interested in seeing, of course, everybody wanted to see transparency in the agreement. Everybody wanted to see it used for a purpose that will address pro-poor issues, development issues, as well as assure citizens that this really is being recovered for their benefit. So that led to the negotiation, which took close to 2 years. And average across all the negotiations, we have seen an average of 2 years, basically. Eventually, Nigeria decided to use these funds for what we call conditional cash transfer, a project that the World Bank was already involved in. And then involved the government, then special investment unit, to take control of the funds and make sure that as the funds were coming through, it was being distributed. World Bank, of course, was supposed to work closely with the government of Nigeria to ensure proper monitoring. One of the shortcomings, I would say, in that agreement was the fact that although we wanted to see active civil society participation in that monitoring, the only thing we succeeded was a language that says the network of asset recovery, civil society should be part of it. So no funds were made available for civil society in the agreement to monitor. When you're talking about conditional cash transfer across Nigeria, that meant that a lot of movement was involved, but we couldn't achieve that. But eventually, of course, we were able to get DFID to fund a civil society organization in Nigeria to do, well, what I would say, partial monitoring. It wasn't really as comprehensive as it should be, which led to what we call Mantra project with ANIJ leading that pack. The second agreement, which I think was significant because we learned lessons from the previous 2017 agreement. This second agreement was in 2020. We call it the 2020 Trilateral Asset Agreement. This particular agreement was between Nigeria, United States, and Bailiwick of Jersey. And because of some of the shortcomings and limitations of the 2017, we insisted on certain parameters. Closely, of course, the parties had to agree on these parameters. There were key 4 pillars that were critical in enabling this agreement. First of all was the pillar of transparency overall. What does that mean? Because, when we talk about transparency, it has different layers. And of course, oftentimes we think that transparency is just to publish. No. So we decided that there would be, first of all, an external auditor, and that external auditor's responsibility was then to audit from time to time any financial report and publish it. The second element there was the issue of making sure that there was an oversight committee. So we set up an oversight committee that met every quarter. This oversight committee also had the civil society organization as a member. Then we agreed to have an agency whose work was, in a way, public-private, if you like. The National Sovereign Investment Authority in Nigeria was set up both as a government and as a public sector entity. And so they maintained what you would call international standards of accounting. And for our partners, the Americans and Bailiwick of Jersey, this was critical. And then finally, we agreed that there must be a civil society monitor embedded in the agreement, not external. Within the agreement, we provided for the terms of reference for the civil society, and then we went out to bid. There was an international bidding process that led to the nomination of a civil society organization. And this civil society organization, now, of course, the work was to visit the project sites on a quarterly basis and to report back to the committee, the oversight committee. We were able to talk to contractors and say to them, if there are issues, we will make sure that those issues are dealt with immediately. I think what matters in all of this is that when negotiating these agreements, you have to be open-minded and you have to be ready because there are challenges. Like I said, averagely, some of the agreements took 2 years. We should not allow, of course, these agreements to take 2 years to negotiate. But the process of negotiation is important, critical component of asset return. And I think we all have to have it at the back of our mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's very informative to know that there has been this evolution in thinking on the side of Nigeria, but also of its partners. I think also the fact that you've been very much emphasizing the need for partnership with the country from whom you're seeking the return of the assets, I think is quite an important element, unless you sort of like reach that level of cooperation that goes beyond basically a negotiation. You're likely to spend some additional time, I guess, in negotiating, I could imagine. But turning over to Emmanuel and digging a little bit deeper to understand really what are the ingredients and what were the ingredients of success that in some way helped Nigeria to be so successful in recovering assets, tracing assets, and of course, eventually returning assets. But I would be in particular interested to understand what were sort of like the key elements of your domestic and institutional framework and the reforms, of course, that you introduced in order to enable Nigeria to be successful in its asset recovery effort. Emmanuel, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. It needs to be emphasized that the success or otherwise of asset recovery must be prefaced by some domestic reforms and institutional reforms. At the home front, asset recovery, often it is from inside to outside. And so you must start at home. And one of the things that a country needs to pay attention to is to have a robust legal regime. In other words, have laws that will help you to successfully investigate, trace, search, trace, and freeze assets in good time. The operating word is timeously. It must be done. And Nigeria was lucky to have in place from the year 2000 to 2003, ICPC, Independent Corrupt Practices Commission Act was passed, followed by the EFCC Act, and then the NFIU, the Nigerian Financial Intelligence, was also established. These institutions working together led to some of the success that we record. Very, very critically was the incorporation of the non-conviction-based asset recovery process, which Nigeria utilized very effectively, both domestically and internationally. And as you well know, this is consistent with Article 4 of the UN Convention Against Corruption. There are certain occasions where criminal process is not the best option to utilize. So you go for the non-conviction-based asset recovery. One of the reforms also, which a country needs to pay attention to, is to ensure that its asset declaration regime that is applicable to politically exposed persons is properly enforced. And that was very helpful in some of the cases that Nigeria utilized by checking what was it that they declared as having as their assets and what is it that they are discovering now. Of course, subsequently, in about 2015, a whistleblower program was also incorporated in the fight against corruption, which also led significantly to the recovery of assets from politically exposed persons. Of course, it need not be further re-emphasized that training and retraining officials is very important, and very critical also is to ensure that a central authority is created to coordinate mutual legal assistance and international cooperation. Nigeria did that at the Office of the Attorney General. The agencies that are involved in corruption in Nigeria, there are several. Although I recognize that countries have their different frameworks, but in Nigeria, there are several. And so that led to the constitution of an interagency tax team that work collaboratively with each other, share intelligence. That intelligence was also shared with foreign law enforcement agencies, which led to successful recovery of assets from politically exposed persons, both in the Abacha and DSP, Darie, and Ibori cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think many countries, especially in the region where I'm now based in Central Asia, are still, I think, struggling to some extent to establish really a full range of asset recovery tools. You mentioned the importance of non-conviction-based asset recovery tools and provisions in your law, but of course also conviction-based forfeiture provisions are absolutely critical. The strength and the dedication and the well-resourcedness of institutions is absolutely critical. And this kind of like domestic coordination and cooperation that you described through the interagency task force that really brings together the specialists from your accounting entities, from your financial intelligence units, of course, the investigators and the legal experts. All of them need to play a role if you want to be successful. Turning to you, Juliet, and I would now like to focus a little bit more on the international aspects of asset recovery. And I would be particularly curious to learn from you what you believe are the most important international ingredients of success, in particular that sort of were relevant in the Nigerian experience. So I'm thinking, of course, first and foremost about the UN Convention Against Corruption that came into being in a large extent, especially its Chapter 5 on asset recovery, thanks to the interventions of Nigeria, but also the multiple international platforms that exist, the Conference of State Parties, the Asset Recovery Working Group, the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, and various other events, one-off as well as sustained over time, that somehow provide a platform to facilitate international cooperation. But for me, much more important is how you see the matter. Could you enlighten us a little bit on this aspect?
Yeah, thank you once again. Yeah, so with Nigeria, we, as a country, we engaged very actively across all the relevant institutions and platforms, which you mentioned. Nigeria was very active during the negotiation of UNCAC, and this was based on lessons learned, working through Abacha case. But Nigeria also played a very significant role in the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, particularly in 2017. During the negotiation of the asset return, the Switzerland-Nigerian return, what happened was that the agreement was eventually signed at the JIFA Forum in DC, in Washington, DC in 2017. And that kind of brought a significant public relations platform for Nigeria to talk about what is required to return assets, the collaboration, the challenges, as well as what needs to happen in future. Moving forward, and a little bit, maybe take it back a bit, 2016 Anti-Corruption Summit in the UK saw Nigeria's president talking about asset recovery and saying that Nigeria and, of course, other African countries need those resources to come back to Africa. And as you are aware, Nigeria also participated actively in the African Union Common African Position on Asset Recovery and making sure that Africa and Nigeria has a stand. So, because we see this as integrated process. But let me also add, in all of this, there's a diplomatic angle to it. Countries don't just return assets. There is a foreign policy angle which we must take into consideration. And that foreign policy angle means that some countries, even though they desire to return the assets, want something in return. They may want another country to improve their human rights standards. They may want them to improve their anti-corruption laws. They may want them to build institutions that respond to anti-corruption. Essentially, what they are saying is that we don't want to return the funds and the funds will go back again. In some places, it's been said to be relating, even though in some of those terminologies, we also say it takes two to tango, because when we talk about foreign briberies, there are multinationals from the Western country, unfortunately, that also foster foreign bribery. But moving away from that, Nigeria remained in touch with our embassies. So, for example, our embassies outside Nigeria was used as platform to engage with those countries. And in country, we use the embassies of those countries to put pressure on them to ensure that assets were returned. So what I'm saying basically here is that the return of assets is something that, one, starts with a cooperative framework. Two, there will be disagreements in that process. And three, parties have to come together for the benefit of citizens. And of course, when we remember that asset recovery has three components, some people will say, first of all, to prevent criminals from walking away with money. Crime should not pay. Then secondly, it should act as a deterrent for people taking away funds to other countries. And third, it should serve as a restoration of justice and promote sustainable development. So if we look at it from these angles, we use these three angles to persuade countries that you can keep these funds. You need to return it to countries of origin. And so Nigeria used this platform actively. I think, did you want me to add a bit on international lawyers at this point? I think one of the things which I'm sure Emmanuel will elaborate on is that regarding international lawyers, Nigeria, realizing that we don't have standing in the countries where these assets are located, the best we could do was to, of course, engage with international lawyers, but also we ensured that there were local Nigerian lawyers who could work with them. Secondly, Nigeria also paired these lawyers closely with Nigerian lawyers in order to build experience and mentor them. And thirdly, there was also the risk approach, what I'll consider that these lawyers, of course, in a way, we are told that you can't be paid until Nigeria gets the funds. So if you do not succeed in your cases, then you take the risk that you've lost time and resources. And so the risks were shared, as it were. And it's something that some people don't really realize, that it's not always the time that when you say lawyers are paid, that's the case. There are so many lawyers that have not been paid, having done this work over a period of time. So I think in that context, of course, when Emma comes in, he can speak more of that. We need to always look at the specialities and the experts that are required. And of course, the legal professionals are number one when you talk about asset recovery. I'm done here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. And indeed, you already gave the launching platform for Emmanuel's next and the question that I would have to him, because you mentioned, Emmanuel, also before, the role of international law firms, so that the Nigerian government engaged in the Abacha case, and I'm sure also in others subsequently. Now, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience of using those law firms, about their relevance in the context, and maybe also some of the things that where you had to manage a little bit the relationship with those law firms, because there are also some jurisdictions that are not terribly interested in having actually the lawyers involved in those asset recovery proceedings. Tell us a bit more.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Juliet has already prefaced the use of international lawyers. Let me say at once that the use of lawyers is both strategic and a necessity in asset recovery. The international lawyers serve two purposes. One is to be able to help a requesting country to navigate the domestic laws of the countries where the assets have been identified or are suspected to be excreted. So they help with that process. They help with tracing, but I must also emphasize that it is not just any international law firm. It must be a law firm with the pedigree and expertise that is very, very much associated with asset recovery. And that is where Nigeria was lucky to engage the services of a law firm headed by Enrico Monfrini in Switzerland. Every Nigerian who is associated with this work of asset recovery and experts around the globe will attest to the fact that Mr. Enrico did a great deal of job in terms of location, in terms of assets, in terms of early freezing. And so also with a law firm that was engaged in the UK, Edward, Angel, and Palmer and Dodge. They also did the work, particularly when Nigeria decided to launch a civil recovery case against the Abachas in the UK. You could only do that with the use of lawyers in that country. And of course, as Juliet said, you need to pair them with your own lawyers so that your lawyers can begin to gain expertise and familiarize themselves with that domestic process. So in the case of these two sets of lawyers that Nigerians use very effectively, it was a huge success. And a whole lot of assets that were recovered both in the UK and Switzerland, and indeed other countries. A person like Mr. Enrico has, over the years, gained the confidence of law enforcement. So they could relate with him, they could speak to him, they could share intelligence with him, because they look at him as almost like one of them. That will make up for the kind of suspicion that certain jurisdictions don't even want you to work with lawyers. But that also emphasizes the need to choose the right set of lawyers that will have the confidence of every other person. So I think the use of law firms is very, very critical, but also use them wisely, discuss the terms wisely. Is it on a profit-sharing basis? Is it on a fee basis? All these things need to be worked out very intelligently and strategically so that you can make the best use of them at the end of the day. Thank you, Oliver.
Yes, I would like to stay with you, Emmanuel. I would like to look at a different angle of the conversation and now focus in on some of the principal challenges that you experienced when seeking to recover stolen assets. Could you tell us a little bit more where you saw some of these emerging?
Okay, we have spoken previously about the need for a strong political will at the domestic level. But I must emphasize that this domestic will is, even though driven by the head of state or the president, as the case may be, must be also strongly supported by other subnational states or regions or all those who are associated with asset recovery. It must be a comprehensive political will to be able to succeed. Otherwise, at every stage, there will be sabotage, there will be frustrations, and all of that. So one of the things which we encountered in the early stages was the frustration associated with the Abacha recoveries in terms of certain political elements not being comfortable with that recovery and doing everything to frustrate it. I recall clearly the case of Bojuani in Jersey was almost frustrated because of certain political elements in Nigeria. And so you must galvanize sufficient political will, not just at the topmost level, but also at the regional level. And of course, law enforcement needs to be well resourced. They need to be well trained. That is the only way they can trace and freeze assets early enough. If there are no domestic leads, it is, you just don't send a letter of request to another country and ask that they should find out if this man has assets there. You must have your evidence domestically as a prelude to that request. So there is a lot of work. If you don't do that, you will not succeed. Asset recovery is expensive. It's important that you have a strategy in place. The cost of investigation, the cost of paying lawyers and other experts is very huge. So you need to be very strategic as to what you are going into. Mutual legal assistance is one of the most frustrating in international cooperation, but it varies from country to country. Some countries are very amenable to support. Some are very slow. Some are inhibited by their legal regimes. Some are suspicious of you. They don't trust you at all. And these are all the challenges that will come in as you attempt to recover assets. And then even when at the stage of recovery, some begin to ask questions which Juliet alluded to. What are you going to use the assets for? Who is going to benefit from it? Are the assets not likely to be relooted or go into waste again? You have to give them a lot of answers to some of these questions. And that is what makes it takes a long time to conclude asset recovery. So it is not a game you enter into just for the fun of it. Know that you are entering into a long drawn war. You will succeed in some very early, in some you may not succeed until after several years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, one of the conversations that we had in this part of the world, in particular in Uzbekistan, is exactly that question. Is it, in order to resource the asset recovery agenda, is it necessary to actually invest some of the recovered assets into supporting the relevant institutions of the country to engage in asset recovery and to provide basically for all these elements that you have been hinting towards. Now, same question to you, Juliet, from your own perspective, what are some of the key challenges that you came across during your time in this game, so to speak, of asset recovery?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the challenges, of course, starting from pre-confiscation stage would be the legal issues. dealing with different legal systems, of course, presents very significant challenges for countries seeking for asset return. Understanding the legal basis on which other countries would or provide international cooperation, of course, is very important. Secondly is the disposition of the other countries, and something we talk about, of course, is again, I mentioned foreign policy angle to which those countries are coming from. And I did mention again, when countries say, oh, we can return awards or penalties from foreign bribery, I disagree with that. And that is something, of course, other countries can have their views about, because it's one of the convention offenses. So why wouldn't there could be collaboration. And I believe there should be, when there's bribery, that countries can come together and negotiate whatever resources or awards or penalties should be involved. Then thirdly is the issue of trust. Trust is a big issue between destination countries and victim countries. And this is because they feel that probably the leaders of the victim countries were involved in looting the funds. And so that trust breach, or rather the need for trust to be built across parties, is very critical at the early stages of the conversation. And secondly is, we mentioned this again, is what would the funds be used for? Becomes another critical element before any assets can be returned. People want to know, where is the fund going to? And in this space, we have, of course, our non-state actors are going to be very actively involved. Now, because UNCAC also recognizes civil society as a component of this process of UNCAC, we can wish it away. We have to find a way to involve them in the conversation. Some countries don't want it, but whether you like it or not, they are part and parcel of that process. And they contribute to transparency. They contribute to communication with the government. They also contribute to with the citizens. Inevitably, one of the things I've said is how we communicate to citizens about asset return also helps to improve trust. Because it's possible that non-state actors will go to the other government and say, why do you want to return these funds? If you return it, they are going to reloot it. So we need to build them into the conversation so that they can also be part of urging for the return of those assets. Finally, I will add that countries that are seeking to have assets return must have a strategic plan. You don't just wake up and say, oh, I saw $1 million over there, I want to go and get it. No, but that's not how it works. You must have a strategy about how you're going to engage, how you're going to make sure the court processes works in your favor, putting together the documents and putting together the parties who are required to be on the table, and then be thinking very early on, how do we get this asset returned? What will we use it for when it's returned? One of the things, again, let me just add this quickly, that when I in some of my conversation with destination where the funds are located, they've said the delay in negotiation comes from victim countries. Because when it comes to the issue of what the assets will be used for, if you don't give them information that satisfies that criteria of transparency, they are not going to return it. And so we need to start early on, even when the confiscation process is going, the negotiation or before the negotiation, during confiscation. We need to start early on to begin to talk about what the funds will be used for. And I think publicity plays a role too. Publicity meaning, how do we publicize what we're doing? We need to publicize that in order to ensure that people understand what we are trying to do. So that communication, two-way communication with citizens, communication with the people, communication with the other parties needs to be ongoing. Communication is very critical. And that openness about what we're doing is also critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. This is very useful. I mean, there's so many questions that come to my mind. We haven't even started to talk about the issue of settlements yet. I think you touched a little bit upon that, Juliet, now in your last statement. But I think I would not be doing a good job unless I would, of course, give our audience the opportunity to ask some questions. There's some interesting questions coming in. So the first one comes from the colleagues in Tajikistan. And it's the first question is to you, Emmanuel. Could you elaborate on what mechanisms are in place in Nigeria to ensure transparency and accountability in the use of recovered assets? And I think that question should then also go to Juliet, because both of you have, of course, some experience in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. The issue of transparency and accountability of returned assets is one thing that runs through the whole process of asset recovery, particularly at the stage of return. You must satisfy the requested country that you have in place domestically a framework that will ensure that the assets are well utilized. And at the framework, which has gained some global recognition, is the use of the World Bank, or in some cases now, as it is emerging, the UN, to supervise the utilization of assets, and also the use of civil society organizations. Nigeria embraced that. In our first attempt to do transparency in the Abacha return, the first set of return, probably that was not properly done, because I recall that some of the monies had actually been spent before the process of instituting transparency came into place. The civil society organization, ARIN, and the rest had to go to the field to only inspect some of the projects that were used, were the projects that were constructed or built with recovered funds. It turned out that some of them were poorly executed or not executed at all. So it is important that there's an effective framework. But subsequently, that was improved upon, and the international agencies, the country that is returning the assets, the domestic civil society, are all now embraced in signed agreements. The important thing to note also is that utilization of return funds is now governed by signed agreements, which principles you must adhere to and utilize throughout the process. So it's not just a domestic thing, internationally, and as it is consistent with best practice, the country returning the assets and civil society are all involved from beginning to the end.
Right. Thank you very much. One of the things that is being asked now, and that question comes from Mrs. Sayora Kodyaeva, the chairperson actually of the Civil Society Advisory Committee of the Jonge Fund. And she's quite interested to learn more about the role of civil society institutions in the recovery, return, and rationale of sale of assets and asset recovery. Now, one of the things that I would be quite curious in the context when you're answering the question, Juliet in particular, could you be so kind to also touch upon and describe really what was the role of civil society in the setup that you had in the last return with the Clean Foundation? Because it sounded to me as if you had integrated civil society into a committee that was composed of both government and civil society. And I'm very curious because here with the Jonge Fund, the model is a little bit different. There is a civil society arrangement, but it is purely civil society. So you don't have those two basically sides working that closely together. And I was just wondering, what was your experience with the setup in Nigeria? Over to you, Juliet.
Thank you. Thank you. So like I said, the agreements indicated from the beginning that a civil society organization would be recruited as a third-party monitor to monitor the process from the spending, from day one, when the spending started. Their job was to, first of all, take the financial report, monitor the procurement process, and then go to the site and ensure that whatever the contractors have put forward have actually been implemented. And so there were about 3 sites in Nigeria where they were required to visit quarterly. They were also supposed to hire other maybe small community groups around this location who will constantly monitor what was going on. Thirdly, in the participation on the oversight committee, this meeting held every quarter. So every quarter, they will come with their quarterly reports. They would come with the information about the visits. They would tell us if there were issues around the procurement, or whether there were issues around the site of the project, or whether in fact, included in that requirement was issues around environmental issues, human rights abuse, labor rights issues, because as an international partner, I believe the US and Bailiwick of Jersey wanted to make sure that Nigeria upheld the highest standard, right? Now, civil society was supposed to do all of this, and then also to monitor the use of the funds and ensure that if the funds were not used for what was agreed on, they would quickly highlight it. And the agreement also mentioned that in highlighting it, Nigerian government would be responsible to refund any money that was not properly utilized. So that already gave them the courage to report. And I think it really worked very well because of the oversight committee. So we were now required to invite the contractors to the meeting if any issue were raised and we felt they weren't allowing the civil society access to the project site, they must be invited. And the implementing agency was also required to release financial and procurement documents. So it was quite detailed and very extensive. But if you like, you can even say it was quite intrusive. And of course, Nigerian government complained at the initial stage when the agreement was being drafted. They eventually were able to agree on it. Thank you.
But we continue to have a lot of questions coming in. The next one is from Jahangir from Uzbekistan, one of the prosecutors who's working actually on asset recovery cases here. He's asking to both of you actually the question, have you ever dealt with a case where jurisdictions where assets were laundered issued a confiscation order based on a domestic investigation that was initiated after your request was submitted? And I think the answer is probably yes, but I let you do the answering. Emmanuel, you want to start?
Okay, thank you very much. That immediately comes to mind, the case of DSP Alamesia, one of the politically exposed persons. What happened in that case was that Nigeria had initiated a domestic investigation. Even though he was arrested in UK, eventually he jumped ship and came back to Nigeria. So but he came back, when he was charged to court, it became apparent to him that, of course, he was going to be convicted if he goes to full trial. So he pleaded guilty on some counts so that he could get a lesser sentence. And once that was done, it became a judgment of the court, which frees both assets in Nigeria and those that were identified. Indeed, the language of the court order was so wide that it covered assets identified both in UK and some other countries, and even assets unknown. So with that judgment, Nigeria was able to use it so elaborately in the UK courts and other courts in South Africa, in the United States, where some of the assets were recovered. So it's possible, and it is really a good strategy. If you can conclude a domestic criminal investigation, it will be used, it will be a very good weapon for you to use internationally if some of the assets are abroad. That happened in that case, and I think that was, it was good enough. Thank you.
Okay, Juliet, same question to you. Now, my sense is a little bit that Jahangir is aiming at a slightly different aspect from the one that you just mentioned, Emmanuel, meaning that you have an MLA request that comes, of course, based on a domestic investigation. But then instead of enforcing your MLA request in the jurisdiction receiving the request, the jurisdiction starts a parallel investigation. And I can remember clearly from my time in STAR that was very often something that we actually encouraged jurisdictions to do. And I think maybe even some of the Swiss cases might be examples of that, where Switzerland started investigations even without receiving MLA requests in some cases. But
absolutely,
sort of like those parallel processes. I don't know who wants to go first. Juliet, maybe if we go first with you and then come back to Emmanuel.
Yeah. Yeah, let me say that's not a problem at all, because what you want to see is results. And as long as you continue to collaborate, it's encouraged. I know that even within the US asset forfeiture framework, they say they can do parallel. They can start with civil and they can also retain the right to go criminal. And they use both. And in Nigeria as well, we retain that capability under our new Process of Crime Act. And one of the things I haven't mentioned here is that Nigeria has also been able to return assets to other countries. And we use both our mutual legal assistance process and our local laws to do that. In terms of those pre-confiscation process, submitting MLA does not mean that the country cannot use its existing laws to do whatever. Maybe they feel that having that parallel approach will respond faster rather than MLA. As all of us know, mutual legal assistance is a very complex process. And so it's possible they would decide under UNCAC, I think Article 54, 55, allows them to use the non-confiscation based laws within their country, knowing fully well that they have the evidence to proceed against those assets without having to rely on a criminal procedure. Now, having said that, the second element is, while that is going on, you should now initiate the process of asset return with a view to making sure that whatever asset is then confiscated does not become held up in that country. So your interest should not necessarily be that procedure. Your interest should be, how do I get my assets back to my country once the procedure for confiscation is concluded? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Emmanuel, do you want to add to that specific question?
Yes. Okay, let me come back to the Abacha cases, which probably also fits very well with the question that was asked. In the Abacha case, even though we initiated the whole process in 1998, once there were earlier indications that some of the assets were in Switzerland and Nigeria engaged the Swiss authorities. The Swiss authorities also did a lot on their own side in terms of launching investigations into those assets. Indeed, it became that the work of Nigeria was only complementary. And the point needs to be made that you just don't send a mutual legal assistance request and sit back. You have to continually engage, and you have to continue also do whatever that you need to do domestically. So it's a shared responsibility, and you must do your bit domestically. And that is exactly what Nigeria did. But once the Swiss authorities realized that a whole lot of assets either were deposited in Switzerland or they passed through Switzerland to other jurisdictions, a wide world investigation was instituted, and that is what led to the discovery of assets in Liechtenstein, in Luxembourg, in Jersey, and several other jurisdictions. So it is possible, but you must do your bit domestically to ignite those international processes.
Excellent. Now, we have another question here from Shukrat, who is interested, and I assume he's interested maybe because he himself is working in a financial intelligence unit, asking actually the question, what is the role in your experience of financial intelligence units? Juliet, you even led one for quite a while, so maybe we start with you.
Well, let me start by saying that the process of financial investigation would, of course, work better with a financial intelligence unit. The role of the FIU is to gather financial intelligence. So a functional FIU would normally have a database consisting of almost all the transactions in a particular country. That financial transaction is also now collaborated by some international transactions where the FIU signs partnership and is working with Egmont Group. Egmont Group is this international body, umbrella body of FIUs that has close to 177 countries. Where they have that access, that means they have access to 177 FIUs, and you can literally, through cooperation, work with other countries to get as much information as you can. So that is the first primary access to information on financial, if it's a financial crime and if the crime has crossed borders. So whether it's domestic financial transaction or international financial transaction, you can access it through the FIU. And so that gives you your first level. But what if the funds are not within the financial system? That means you are looking at other ways, and that other ways could then lead you into sending the MLA because you already have some intelligence, or requesting for international cooperation of other countries where assets other than financial information is located. So asset recovery offices must work very closely with the FIU in every country because that's the primary source of information. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Emmanuel, you want to add anything to this question, or shall I give you the next one?
Well, I could only support Juliet by saying that NFIUs, as you well know, are structured differently globally. Some are law enforcement, some are administrative based, and some are a hybrid of the two. Depending on the one you are managing, you have to use it in the most effective manner. All transactions, particularly involving international process of crime, will most naturally may have passed through financial institutions domestically. And so that becomes the launch pad of the investigators in terms of establishing who put in this money and all of that. But it's very complicated. That is why we talk about experts. Even in FIU, it must be manned by very good experts, forensic experts, legal experts, and financial experts who are good at reading into the multiple levels of money laundering that are associated with stolen assets. So it is important that law enforcement work collaboratively with law enforcement domestically and with their counterparts of the Egmont Group. And so I should say that NFIU must be utilized in a way that will quicken the investigation of stolen assets domestically, because that will help you to also quicken the process of mutual legal assistance once you have started, and also help you with the freezing orders, which are very necessary at the beginning of the process.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's another question from our colleagues in Tajikistan, and they're interested now to go back really to the issues of obstacles in international cooperation in criminal matters, really. So really the MLA request. What are the key ones that you have experienced in the context of asset recovery? Maybe we start with you this time, Emmanuel, and then go over to Juliet.
Okay. The obstacles run through the whole process. From the very beginning, the counterpart assesses your jurisdiction. First, are you a very corrupt country? If you are, the way they relate with you will probably be different from another jurisdiction. And that is why the whole issue of trust and confidence comes in at the very, very beginning. And if they assess your jurisdiction as corrupt, they are suspicious that probably you just want to get back money so that you can steal it again. So you need to build that trust from the beginning. Then, of course, we have said that legal regimes vary from country to country. We are a common law country. When you are making a request to a civil law country, their domestic laws are different and their approaches to some of these issues are different. Until the coming of the UNCAC, some countries could not even entertain any request except there is a criminal investigation. But that has changed with the coming of into force of the UNCAC. So, and then sometimes it's the issue of language. You are an English-speaking country, another country is a French-speaking or Spanish-speaking country, and then you send a legal, you mistake to send a legal request in English to a country that is non-English speaking. They will tell you first, after probably of 6 months or 1 year, they come back to you to translate your request into the domestic language of that country. And so you have wasted 1 year just on the simple issue of language. So that is why we reemphasize again and again that you must have a strategic plan. Any assets you want to embark to recover must be backed up with a plan. And you ask yourself pertinent questions from the beginning. Who needs to do what? What is involved? What are the requirements of the country where we are suspecting these assets are? You have to answer those questions at least at the first level before you embark on the process. Otherwise, what you would have resolved through the diplomatic channels, even domestically, you waste so many months and years to resolve. So these are some of the challenges of trust, of language, of suspicion, and of lack of evidence. Lack of evidence. If you don't have evidence that will support your request, some countries will be very reluctant to start a process of supporting you. That's why I said it's a mutual assistance, it is a shared responsibility, and you must be seen to have done your own level of work before the other country can be ignited to support you. Those are the few challenges I want to mention.
Right. And I would like maybe also to add that the MLA request should never be the first thing that the first time that the country receiving the MLA request hears about the case. You should have definitely engaged before at an informal level. You should have used all these platforms we made reference before, the Asset Recovery Working Group, the Conference of State Parties. There are so many opportunities for practitioners to come together in different fora and to essentially start this conversation and get the advice from the country that you're seeking to request from on how best to proceed. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to take the advice on face value and just try to go with it, but definitely the country should not be for the first time hearing about the case when you're sending the MLA request. That typically then leads exactly to some of those challenges that Emmanuel and Juliet made reference to. Now, there's some more questions here, so we will maybe go for another 15 plus minutes so that we are stopping at the 1.5 hour mark. The next question is actually coming from the ARIN-WCA the Secretariat. Now here there's an interesting question, but maybe we can ask even Juliet and her center, sorry to take you a little bit more of additional work, because there's a specific question about the legislative acts, the specific normative documents that regulate the issue of asset recovery in Nigeria and whether these could be shared. I'm sure you have a full list already. We have the EFCC Act, the ICPC Act. Of course, we have the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is to a large extent bringing much of this together, but there's also the Advanced Fee Fraud Act and a couple of other Nigerian legal tools that contain very important provisions and that make that legal framework of yours so robust. But if you could help with that, maybe we can make that available after the webinar.
Yes,
that's okay.
Let me just add to say that in addition to all of those laws, Nigeria has obviously over the past 20 years, tried to bring together lessons learned over the years into one document that is now called the Proceeds of Crime Act, which was passed in 2022. So while, we have disparate laws here and there, I think all those, aspects of bits and pieces is here can be found in the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is 2022, which is our latest law. And if you check the website we provided here, the African Center website, of course, if you go there, you will find it in the resources. And just to add that, in addition to all of those laws, we also have the Mutual Legal Assistance Act passed in, I believe, 2019. We have the FIU Act also passed in 2018. And so what I will encourage you, maybe Oliver, after the meeting, is to be in touch and we can share those laws if they want to use it for their work. Yes.
Excellent. No, that would be most appreciated, I'm sure. Thank you so much. Yes, and I think we should also mention that, of course, there are the provisions which are directly dealing with confiscation, seizure, the investigative powers to trace assets, and so on. And of course, those ones largely are regulated now in the Proceeds of Crime Act. But there are also those other, and I think it was in particular Emmanuel much earlier in this conversation who mentioned them, that can be critical in the context of asset recovery, like the asset declaration system, for example, or the Whistleblower Protection Act. All of these can, in one way or the other, play a very important role in individual cases. Also in cases of asset recovery, and for complete legal framework, I think one should always take the broadest possible perspective on looking at those things. And of course, the UN Convention Against Corruption provides a pretty good and comprehensive framework to doing so. Now, this leads me perfectly over to the next question, which comes from Timur Savarov, again from Uzbekistan. And he asks, the question arises as to whether the United Nations Convention Against Corruption can serve as a legal basis for asset recovery in the absence of bilateral and multilateral mutual legal assistance treaties. Yes, I think there's the legal theory and then there's the practical reality. So let's go first with the practical reality as you have experienced it. Have you come across a country that has allowed you to use the convention directly as a basis for international cooperation? Juliet, maybe first.
Yeah. So some of the agreements that we sign, we always indicate that the basis, first of all, is UNCAC. UNCAC has also provided a requirement that in the absence of bilateral or multilateral agreements, countries can rely on the convention as the basis for negotiation. But this is presupposing that both countries are members of UNCAC as well. And so you find that countries wait to do bilateral and multilateral where they can actually just cite UNCAC as the basis for cooperation. So this is allowed under UNCAC. This is also allowed, countries can reach agreements and say in the absence of bilateral. But if you have bilateral, fantastic. The problem is that most bilateral don't cover in detail some of the requirements on asset recovery. The issue about duality and the rest of them, dual criminality. So avoid all of that and go for the convention as the basis for your negotiation. And of course, basis for request too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Emmanuel, what is your experience in that regard?
We started off without the UNCAC. Of course, Nigeria was very participatory in the making of UNCAC itself, particularly Chapter 5 on asset recovery. I think the important thing in practice is the attitude of jurisdictions vary also to this issue. Even those who are both members of the UNCAC, they will always want a bilateral engagement, which of course, I think that with UNCAC as the umbrella, nevertheless, they emphasize that bilateral engagement with them for purposes of asset recovery. So my check will be that much as UNCAC has provided for countries to utilize that instrument for purposes of asset recovery, you should use both. And as you well know, the first level of engagement is bilateral. And once you have exploited that bilateral process by engaging the country that is involved, then you could calibrate the conversation using the UNCAC, even though UNCAC is a general framework which all countries who are members can utilize. So my check is that you should you should use both. Indeed, when you relate that to the recovery of assets, particularly based on settlements, you discover that the bilateral tool is much more effective than just relying on UNCAC, because countries may not accept your utilization of UNCAC for purposes of settlements. They want to engage with you on a bilateral basis. So that my takeaway is that use both as much as possible, but begin with bilaterals.
Okay, excellent. Now, a completely different question to you, Juliet, and it comes also from Tajikistan. There's an interesting question here. The colleague is asking whether you have encountered cases in your practice where individuals voluntarily returned illicitly acquired assets for example, to mitigate their criminal liability in the country or for similar reasons. And I know that Nigeria ran a voluntary return scheme for a while, so maybe this is an interesting question to you.
I think the one that comes to mind very quickly is even the case of Abacha, really, because at some stage they of course volunteered and signed an agreement indicating that they were willing to let go and not continue the litigation they started against Nigeria. And it's rare, especially if they feel like they have a good case, that for an individual to let go. Then when there's so much evidence against them and they don't want to be prosecuted criminally, they would, of course, give up through negotiation with the country that is pursuing the case. So yes, we've had that experience. And I think it's something that, of course, it can be explored, first of all, in country before international. They want assurances, obviously, that you will not continue with criminal prosecution against them. And the agreement has to state that, that the person has voluntarily, it's almost like the plea bargaining process, to say that the person is plea bargaining without further prosecution and without criminal liability. So those are assurances that would often come into play for them to say, okay, we are ready to not to continue contesting the assets from being returned to Nigeria. Yeah. Of course, in some cases, if the person have fled jurisdiction and didn't come out, that means that automatically the funds will be taken over through non-confiscation based approach in many jurisdictions. Then if the person is contesting, that is the option of plea bargain to say we're ready to give up these assets in return for non-prosecution.
Thank you. That's really very helpful. I think we're slowly coming towards the end. So I would like maybe to turn to you, Emmanuel, and sort of like taking a step back and looking at it more broadly, sort of like what would be your 3 sort of key recommendations to any country that starts to embark on a journey of asset recovery, on an approach to asset recovery, especially when confronted sort of like with a large potential case? What would you tell them to do, or also maybe not to do?
But probably I should begin from where Juliet stopped. In the case of Abacha, that voluntary recovery or voluntary return of $800 million was not honest. The reason being that they did not disclose all the assets. The condition for the surrender was that they were going to disclose everything, but they never did. And so when the government discovered more assets, they were going after them. And then they said government should only limit itself to the agreement they had signed. And that was what botched that agreement. So it is important that when you are going into such voluntary returns, the government must arm itself to it by ensuring that all disclosures, that the clause on all disclosure must be emphasized. But I must say, we have said it again and again in the course of these proceedings that Political will is an important tool in asset recovery, and it's really critical. However, very critically, countries must not deploy political will for the wrong purposes. And when I mean wrong purposes is when there is no evidence to support an investigation or to support the pursuit of asset recovery, whether domestically or internationally, don't embark on it. That is the reason for the strategy. I recall to mind recently, Nigeria lost all the cases associated with the so-called recovery of $1.1 billion from JP Morgan, Shell, and Eni. They lost those cases in the Italian courts, in the UK courts, domestically, because as it became evident, there was no evidence to support that assets were stolen. And that process was embarked upon for some political reasons. And I think countries should not do that. That is the second point. And thirdly, manage your expectations. Don't embark on asset recovery with large expectations. Communicate very effectively, but be one that your expectations may not be met. And so countries should be guided by that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That last aspect in particular about the communication strategy that needs to accompany your asset recovery effort. Very glad that you came to that point still. Juliet, same question to you. What are sort of like the key 3 pieces of advice that you would like to leave our audience with?
Well, I think first of all, I did mention that there is need for a strategy when a country sets out to, first of all, if you have identified the assets, what is your strategy to engage with the other country? That's one, and that strategy must look at your legal capabilities and whether you need an external lawyer or Number 2 is how friendly are you with the other country? How do you establish trust, first of all, with their embassies in your country, and then externally using your own country embassies to try to also move forward. Like I said, it's a foreign policy issue. That's what asset recovery has become. It's not just a legal issue. So don't just situate it within the legal framework, situate it within the foreign policy agenda and how you engage with other countries. Number 3 is building skills and expertise is very critical. So from your financial investigators to your lawyers who are supposed to go to court, and then to your legal system being responsive to what is required. Now, why you deal with, so we have this idea of the domestic recovered assets and the international. If you don't get your domestic recovery right, it's almost difficult to get the international right because they are so interlinked. Interlinked in the sense that you may be requested from other countries to assist them to recover assets in your country and you are struggling with it. So how do you then provide support when they need your evidence to be able to assist you in confiscating assets? So they are really interwoven. So those are the key issues, both the strategy, the engagement with other countries from a diplomatic and foreign policy perspective, as well as making sure that you get your laws and your legal systems and your experts in country all working very well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, really a massive thanks to the both of you, Emmanuel, Juliet, for both answering all these questions and of course for giving us this wealth of experience that you have both in this field, having played yourselves very active roles in the asset recovery effort of Nigeria. For the audience, I would like to say that we're going to be seeing each other again 2 weeks from now, Friday, same time, same place. We're going to actually have the great pleasure of next Friday, the Friday in 2 weeks, to be joined by the experts from the Independent Commission Against Corruption of Hong Kong. We will have Mr. Sudhir Gidwani and Mr. Gavin Lau. from the Asset Recovery Office inside the Independent Commission Against Corruption joining us. And they will be talking, of course, about asset recovery. What else? And we're very much looking forward to that. And of course, there's many other webinars that we have already planned, but we will make and announce them in due course. So for that, I think 1.5 hours of asset recovery for now is good enough. As Mr. Emmanuel said, sometimes asset recovery, we need to go for what is good enough, not for everything necessarily. And we do exactly the same. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for joining us from so many countries, and have a nice evening, afternoon, or morning. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for being with us. If you'd like more details, please reach out via the emails listed below.